On Monday of this week, we mark 68 years since Pearl Harbor was attacked by Japanese forces, which resulted in the United States becoming involved in World War II. We honor those that lost their lives in the most horrific attack on our country prior to 9/11. On December 7th, 1941, we were caught like sitting ducks, and 2,300 soldiers, sailors, and civilians lost their lives to Japanese bombs. The senior admiral and the senior general in charge of our defenses were soundly condemned by the government, and for 60 years, the blame was kept on them. Recently, however, we have learned that Franklin Delano Roosevelt told some of his closest advisors in 1940 that he would love it if he could maneuver the Japanese into attacking the United States. Even his then Secretary of State, Henry Stimson, would write years later, after FDR was dead, that FDR actually predicted the Pearl Harbor attacks. We now know that the admiral that was disciplined and the general that the government disciplined actually tried to engage the Japanese fleet at sea, hundreds of miles from Pearl Harbor, but were prevented from doing so by their superiors in Washington. So was December 7th, 1941 a day of infamy, or was the infamy FDR's? The Pearl Harbor attacks got us into World War II in Europe and Asia, and we defeated monsters. But would Americans have reelected FDR if they knew he caused Pearl Harbor? And did we defeat some monsters only to have them replaced by others? Can FDR himself escape history's condemnation for having murdered our own troops on December 7th, 1941? Joining me now is Lew Rockwell, chairman of the Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama. Lew, welcome back to Freedom Watch.
Judge, great to be with you.
Can FDR escape the condemnation of history as these things start to come out, first by journalists, then by historians, that he knew what was going to happen and ardently wished for and even facilitated the attacks so that he could go against his promise that none of your boys will ever fight in a foreign war unless we're attacked first?
Well, he's a president who will live in infamy because he did indeed engineer the attack on Pearl Harbor. And when I think of Pearl Harbor, I always think of the fact that after the ships were attacked and they were overturned, a lot of the sailors continued to be alive in the air bubble inside the hull and desperately sending out signals to try to be rescued, and they died there. And I always think of that when I think of Roosevelt. You know, he even brought the fleet from California out to Pearl Harbor to get it ready to be attacked. And I think Robert Stinnett's fantastic book called Day of Deceit, that's Stinnett, he's a World War II veteran. He, by the way, thinks Roosevelt was right to cheat us into the war, to lie us into the war as he did. But he, through Freedom of Information requests, has fantastic documentation on how Roosevelt sought to bring about Pearl Harbor, was delighted it happened. And by the way, I'm so thrilled that you have a chapter in your forthcoming book on lies the government told you on this horrendous crime called Pearl Harbor.
Well, Stinnett's book is one of the best out there, and he's a very interesting guy because he's a buddy in World War II of a young Navy pilot by the name of George H.W. Bush. And years later, he would actually work for President Bush towards the tail end of his career in naval intelligence. Now in retirement, as you say, under the Freedom of Information Act, getting all of these documents. Can you imagine, Lew, what the country would have thought and what it would have done had it known that FDR himself literally maneuvered American troops into harm's way and caused them to be murdered because he needed an excuse to turn the tide of public opinion so that we could fight World War II? I mean, at the time, public opinion was 88% against getting involved in World War II. I don't remember public opinion ever being that one-sided in the history of taking polls. So in order to change public opinion, he engineers the murder of 2,300 young Americans.
Judge, I also want to mention Thomas Mahl's book, Desperate Deception. This is M-A-H-L. He shows how British intelligence helped maneuver us into that war, and indeed finagle with the polls. I never have thought the same about public opinion polls ever after, because they paid the public opinion pollsters to show to indicate a lie that more and more Americans were for getting into the war, when, as you say, the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of Americans did not want to get into that war. That war that, we were allied with. We fought a monster, as you mentioned. We fought monsters, but we were allied to a monster, maybe even the greatest monster, Joseph Stalin.
Right.
So it's really the whole thing is not quite the black and white story that we're told in the media and in the official histories. It's a very mixed business, World War II. I was once asked by the Washington Times what kind of before they built the World War II memorial, what my suggestion for a memorial was. They didn't print this. I said, how about 50 million bronze skulls on the mall?
Wow. Well, what does this tell you about myth and power and deception, Lew Rockwell, that we could live for 60 years, 3 generations, before the truth would finally start to make its way out? It always does. Something about truth. It always manages to come out. But 60 years later, after so much death and destruction, we finally learn about this.
Well, it's interesting that the State Department during World War II set up a commission of historians to try to make sure that this sort of information would never come out, because they were upset about the fact that after World War I, everybody learned that Woodrow Wilson had tricked us into that war, and they didn't want the same thing to happen with Roosevelt. But as you said, the truth did come out. We now know, of course, that President Bush lied us into the war in Iraq. President Johnson lied us into the war in Vietnam. This is unfortunately seems to be the regular MO of the war presidents. That they lie us into these wars that for their own reasons they want to get into, but the American people are opposed to it. The American people are supposed to be determinative in this. We're not supposed to have the president trick us into wars, but that unfortunately seems to be the way it goes.
In a sense, it's the worst thing that any president or any office holder could do, lying to the people that put him in office, which lies result in the loss of innocent life and the loss of property and the loss of freedom, because generations believe in those lies. Lew Rockwell, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for joining us on Freedom Watch.
Judge, thank you.